Hi everyone, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to attend the Road to Recovery webinar. Really excited to put on what's designed to be a highly actionable event and help firms be as best prepared possible for the times ahead. In terms of introducing our speakers, really, it almost feels like they don't need any introduction other than myself, because lots of you won't know who Mail Manager are. My name's Jacob Wardrop. I'm the Commercial Director at Mail Manager. If you haven't come across us before, we are part of the Arup Group and provide a solution, an Outlook add-in designed for companies to address their email management headache, which Arup initially created around 10 years ago. Then delighted to be joined. I'm going to say delighted with every speaker, so I'll just say delighted to be joined by all of our speakers. The first one's Andy Steele, CEO at Osborne and Deputy Chair of Build UK. We've got Anne Bentley, Board Director at Ride Lever Bucknell and member of the CLC. Fergus Harradence, who's Deputy Director of Construction at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And Matt Bennion, Chairman of Reds 10, a company operating in the modular sector and previously CEO of Arcadis and EC Harris. So really great panel. So thank you to all the speakers for joining us. So what are we going to cover today? The real objective of this event is to provide companies or give you, the audience, the best possible strategy coming out of a crisis and ask industry experts for questions which are near and dear to you. So we're going to start by talking through some of the current challenges in restarting project work and getting back to, I suppose, or finding our new normal. A couple of things which we're going to cover in there is some of the challenges around risk and overrunning costs. Demand and pipeline is going to be really key. So we're going to talk through where the demand is and how to generate pipeline moving forwards. The third point is around investment behaviours, and that's really trying to talk through and encourage everyone to learn lessons from past crises and past recessions to help put an end to suicide bidding on projects. And then the fourth point, which is one which I was very keen to include, is how to make change actually happen. I think we've probably all read and listened to things on which talk about why the construction industry needs to change and what it needs to do, but there's not always a great amount of discussion over how that should actually happen and whether that should be led from the private sector or what we should ask from the public sector. And then the final point is we're going to start talking through making up for lost time, and that's really, given that most sites are operating at 40–50% reduced productivity on projects which have pre-agreed tight margins, how do we make up for lost time and get back to delivering profitable projects? So that's what we're going to go through, and we'll get kind of straight into it. So just a final point before we do that, the output of this event is a 15-page document, which is a leadership playbook, which will summarize the content of this webinar. It will be released a few days after the event, and that will basically be a leadership playbook which gives you some key guidance and actionable examples and advice on the areas we're going to cover. So we'll be releasing details of that a few days after the webinar, but that's kind of the output of this event. So in terms of the current challenges, Andy, thanks very much for joining us. Could you just lay out where you see, or what you see being the top 3 challenges in restarting project work before we talk about how to overcome them?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you. Can't think of a better way to spend my birthday than being on a webinar with you guys. So
happy birthday.
Thank you. Straight into it. I don't think anybody can underestimate the impact of what we've been through and are going through. Clearly, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out, as you quite rightly say, if productivity levels are 40–50% of the normal, then the simple maths is going to take twice as long to build something. That's the simple equation to what the industry is looking at. Obviously, that depends on where you are on the project, the nature of the project. But those are the sort of figures that the industry's been reporting. Some are reporting getting back to sort of 70% productivity levels. They're sort of, the sort of levels that we've seen with social distancing as it is. As I say, when you've got the finishing trades on the site, that makes it very difficult. The early stages, less difficult. So we've seen that. We've seen an awful lot of manufacturers be closed and furloughing their staff. And if you take the fact that Scotland's only just come back into production, if you're looking for materials, as we have been from Scotland, that has a massive impact on certain sites. And that's just created a whole series of out of sequence working. You know, it's not just about the productivity level, it's about the fact that you're now working out of sequence on projects because of the supply of materials. We've seen utility companies close and only do emergency works. So actually getting final site connections and finishing jobs has been virtually impossible. And then there's the whole logistics program on every site, and actually having to put in place new welfare facilities, greater logistics planning, and the whole disruption that that's caused. So yeah, it's been pretty massive for all of the production level on the sites. So that sort of draws a picture of where we are.
Yeah, no, I think that's particularly important, and the point you make around obviously operating and trying to get materials from Scotland, certainly isn't something which I'd considered. And welcome, first of all, and from your point of view, what are the sort of different behaviours, I suppose, you're seeing in when it comes to restarting projects?
I mean, it's fair to say that we're seeing quite wide-ranging behaviours. At the sort of, if you like, the top end of the spectrum, we're seeing significant collaboration between clients and contractors, agreeing how the sites will restart, how delays will be paid for, how delays will be dealt with contractually. And it's fair to say that that's probably more in the public sector than the private sector. We are also seeing at the other end of the spectrum, clients simply refusing to talk to contractors and simply sort of almost sending them a copy of the contract saying, this is what you signed, this is what you agreed to do, and this is what we expect. So we are seeing quite wide-ranging behaviours. I mean, I think it's fair to say, and Andy will probably know this better than I will, within the contractors themselves, we are definitely seeing sort of levels of innovation. We're certainly seeing things like longer site hours have now been agreed by most local authorities. We're seeing much more detailed logistics planning so that the hours that people have got available can be maximised. But clearly, the social distancing does hamper everybody. So it's very wide ranging, and it's fair to say I don't think we've really seen the full contractual impact yet. I think that many clients and indeed many contractors, if I'm honest, are reserving their positions. So people are getting on with it, but we don't really know what the fallout's going to be. And I don't think we'll know what the fallout would be for probably at least another 6 months.
Okay, interesting. And Matt, from your point of view, naturally there's talk of a stimulus and hopefully not the start of more austerity. But what do you see as the best way forward?
I think it's really got to be a range of measures, and there's no question that a stimulus is going to be required. And indeed, there are elements of that are already in play. When you're, as Andy says, you're facing the biggest downturn, really since records began, then yes, the stimulus is absolutely going to be required. But I think sometimes people get a little bit carried away with that all being about pumping money into the system, and I'm not sure that's the only thing. I probably see there being, 3 or 4 things that really need to come together. Perhaps the first is about keeping cash moving, and there's a number of ways that can happen, but having a pipeline of projects is important, and having visibility of that, but also keeping the momentum on those projects is going to be particularly important. So not tying projects up in bureaucratic decision making. And when we talk about shovel ready projects, I think there's an obligation there to kind of accelerate decision making. Anne touched on payment. We need to keep payments going, and actually we've seen some pretty good behaviors here, and people who are looking to keep the cash cycle moving, and that's really, really important when a lot of organisations are struggling with cash flow. They're perhaps taking on some debt in this period as well, so they've got some risk of failure. coming there. And we need to get early resolution of these disputes, and that will all keep the cash moving. I think the second area is perhaps creating the environment for innovation. Perhaps trying to remove some of the uncertainties. The biggest thing in a downturn is uncertainty, and that's what stands in the way of people putting good ideas on the table and making the right investments. So I think clarifying planning, and there was a good move yesterday as well in housing that will help speed up planning and planning disputes. There, perhaps bringing a longer term view to procurement. Maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later on. And also, I think now is the time to really look at what collaboration is all about, because there's no question in my mind we're going to need to collaborate our way through some of the challenges that we've seen, because people just haven't seen them before. And maybe two other areas, I think we are going to need to stimulate capacity. We're already seeing a shift towards offsite and people recognizing that can make a difference here. Well, that's going to chew up the capacity the industry has quite quickly. And I think we need to learn the lessons, even if you go back to the Second World War, for how to create capacity out of industries that have perhaps declined, but how we use that capacity to repurpose it towards other uses like offsite manufacturing and modular. And then the big message is I just think everybody needs to think long term. Massive opportunity here to really think about greening our process, to think about how we use finance better and how we use digital capabilities to modernize the way that we do things. So I think if clients and suppliers and government are all on that longer term agenda, that's a huge part of stimulus as well.
Okay, Andy, do you want to come back in there?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to come back to, I agree with everything you just said, but I'd just like to come back on what Anne was talking about, behaviours, because I think that's the starting point of a lot of this. What we have seen as a company, and listening to a lot of my colleagues across the industry, we've seen a huge range of behaviours, mainly by government departments, really extremes. We've seen some fantastic behaviours in those which have seen the opportunity to push ahead with activity. And we've been very fortunate. Our infrastructure business has seen actually production levels, the amount of work that we've actually done increase. Where with Network Rail and Highways England taking the opportunity of less traffic on the roads and rail. And then we've seen really, really poor behaviours where the government's been very clear with its guidance on PPN 0220. But a lot of government departments have not complied or followed the spirit of that at all. We've actually had situations where we have KPIs on performance, and because we had staff off, either furloughed or sick, they've actually instigated those penalties. And it's that level of inconsistency which is just unacceptable for the industry. So we need to get government departments to think about their behaviour across the piece. We've got the whole range out there, and that leads then into the contractual positions. The contractual positions are difficult. I don't think we've made the industry easy by issuing guidance, not legislation. There are impacts to everybody in this piece, and pushing the pressure down into the construction companies alone to bear the cost isn't a reasonable position. We get a lot of sympathy from a lot of customers, but not a lot of sharing the actual cost.
Okay, well, Fergus, great to have somebody from the government on, so great opportunity to go over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the comments that have been made previously, because I think they cover the main challenges that the industry faces. But for me, they could almost all be brigaded under the single heading of uncertainty. There's uncertainty about the duration, the level of disruption, and the consequent costs caused by COVID-19, a lot of uncertainty about what will happen in future. For example, will there be a second spike in coronavirus cases? Will we move to a situation where we perhaps, as you've seen in Germany just in the past day or so, have localised lockdowns that could have a big impact on construction sites in certain areas? We simply don't know. And that level of uncertainty creates really significant challenges for both construction clients, including those in the public sector, and also firms in the construction supply chain who are actively working on projects now or contemplating starting work on sites which may be subject to disruption, and wondering what the implications are going to be for the schedules that they're proposing, or what contractual terms they should be signing up to with clients. And I think the messages that we want to put out to the industry at this point are, yes, we accept there is a great deal of uncertainty, and we also accept, picking up on Andy's point, which is entirely right, that the way in which some government guidance and advice has been issued has not aided legal clarity and has complicated matters in terms of how particular clauses in construction contracts should be interpreted. But equally, the industry and its clients do have choices about how they behave. And that's what we've been trying to influence through some of the guidance that we have issued about responsible contractual behaviour. Because frankly, we all face an enormous challenge at this point in time. And the last thing that everybody needs, and the thing that will be entirely counterproductive, is if everybody rushes to consult lawyers and rushes to initiate various clauses in their contracts linked to KPIs or performance, non-performance, because this is just going to cause all sorts of friction within supply chains, and it's going to undermine the kind of collaboration that we need from everybody in the supply chain to work out how we best manage this current situation, how we deal with some of the costs that have already been incurred, and more importantly, how we put in place some more flexible and responsible provisions into construction contracts and practices around how these are managed that enable the industry to get back to work as soon as possible, and hopefully start to do more and more work and achieve higher levels of sustainable output on construction sites, including delivering some of the projects that we're going to be bringing forward as government, following the announcement made a week or so ago about the new pipeline of £37 billion worth of projects that we're going to try and push forward over the next couple of years.
Great. Okay. Well, I think naturally we could spend a lot more time on each of these topics, but in the interest of time, we'll move on to the pipeline point. We're doing lots of these events, and probably the only thing in common is with them is my ability to forget something. So just on that, there's a Q&A feature in Zoom, and if you've got any questions for the panelists, then please answer the questions in the put the questions in the Q&A, and we'll come to them at the end, if that's okay. Moving on to demand and pipeline, we'll start with yourself, Anne. I think, from your point of view, do you see, existing projects being radically very, very different, which could create some level of opportunity? Or do you think undoubtedly there's going to be some sectors which are a lot more buoyant than others?
I mean, we're already seeing that. I mean, as cost managers, we see many schemes way before they would hit the actual building sites, if you like. We see feasibility studies, plans, etc. And it's fair to say that our sort of pipeline reflected pretty much what we saw across the general economy. So, things like our hospitality clients, our pubs, our hotels, etc., pretty much all put not just their existing sort of plans on hold, but they put their future plans on hold as well. And clearly the impact that that's going to have on the industry could be a very long-term impact. But similarly, Fergus has already talked about the government's pipeline. That has been really well received across the whole industry, because actually just seeing what the sort of areas, the sectors that are likely to get investment means that people can start gearing their businesses up to those. So, infrastructure, education, potentially social housing. We are seeing people beginning to make plans in those areas again. So that gives us a bit more confidence of a sort of future order book, if you like. From our particular point of view, though, there are 2 or 3 industries that if anything are busier now than they ever were. So we do quite a lot of work in the data center area, and of course everybody's working from home and everybody wants more broadband, so that they've been really busy. We've seen food retail is extremely busy, and anything to do with supporting health services is very busy. So it's a very, very mixed picture indeed. And, clearly I think going forward, all businesses are going to have to flex to that. I mean, there are some parts of the construction economy that are unlikely to pick up in the next 6 to 12 months. There are other sectors that will be very busy, and we've all got to adapt to that and adopt the ways of working that will best sort of secure that work, I think.
Great. And Matt, from your point of view on this topic?
Well, I definitely see, the growth areas that Anne's talking about. I think, there will be opportunities that come up. Well, what we've seen is that we've built our assets, whether you're in health, education, retail, whatever, on a particular way of operating, and the rule book just got ripped up, and people will be rethinking and repurposing their assets left, right, and centre. And I think that's the opportunity to get into. I think. There is a broader issue here, though, that says actually I think the way through some of this is for organisations to come together and collaborate around solutions. If everything that you've previously done has just changed, it's probably true to say that no individual client organisation or supply side organisation is going to have all of the answers. And actually, from my perspective, this is a great opportunity to really transform the way our industry works, for clients and suppliers to come together and to try and solve the challenges that they have. And that will only come from a transparency about what the real issues are for each other. And just to bring that to life, we perhaps think about ourselves, the client has to do this and the advisors have to do that and the contractor has to do that. But right now, what are some of the bigger issues that we're looking at? Well, cash is going to be hard to find, and people are going to want to defer capital payments. We know we've got issues with housing. We know that homelessness is an issue that we want to crack. And rather than thinking about all these things as independent issues that we go to independent partners for advice on or solutions on, maybe we all need to come together and put together solutions which are funded differently. Perhaps we think about not just providing accommodation for homeless people, but we think about using that agenda to drive training, using that agenda to build apprenticeships, to put people back into long-term work. And to do that, you need to combine different skills and work in a very, very different way. And certainly, I think there's a lot of pipeline and demand that can be created by that sort of collaborative innovation and different organizations coming together.
Okay, interesting. And Andy, I suppose a question to you would be, there's obviously companies who operate in some of these sectors which are less buoyant, shall we say, and might know they're strong there. So, I mean, what would be your advice to someone who's wondering whether to be very opportunistic and pivot into new sectors or to stay where they're already strong?
Interesting question. In simplistic terms, I think one of the problems with our industry is that we've tried to pivot quite a lot, and we try to be very generalists. But actually, the real skills of companies is understanding what I classify as asset classes. You understand how they're constructed, you build a reputation in construction, that's a form of asset class. And then but jumping around typically from one product to another product invariably just brings problems because you don't understand it. So it's very tempting to do because you see a huge growth in a certain area. I think we can't underestimate where we are today. I think there's this great talk about the future. I really applaud that and I really appreciate that. And I do think what Matt says about ripping up the order book, ripping up the rule book is vital. But that's got to start with customer behaviour. To me, that is the driving point of all of this. Just stop and think about where we are as an industry at the moment today. The road to recovery is fantastic. It was a great concept, but it's about today. 11.4% redundancies is what the industry is expecting across the piece. That's a significant reduction of skills at a time when skills are needed to come into the industry. So we do need to look at this pipeline from now, and that is driven by customer behaviour. So trying to get this workload back on track. Let's not go for a race to the bottom that we've seen historically. Let's keep people focused on where they're good and the products that they're good at delivering. and let's work together on this rather than do what the industry's been fantastic at doing in most downturns, and that's fight the way to the bottom. And then in a few years' time, we'll see the carnage that comes through with that behaviour.
Yeah, no, really, really important point on skills shortages, which felt, top of everyone's agenda really until a few months ago. Fergus, just really wondering from your point of view, well, yeah, your point of view on, I suppose, where the pipeline is moving forwards and what role the public sector can play in this.
No, I think the public sector has an important role, two main areas. Firstly, it's in terms of acting as a responsible client ourselves and pushing the industry to improve the way in which it operates, but also to contract with the industry in a fair, reasonable and transparent way, and require firms in the industry to adopt the kind of behaviours that we want to see. So, for example, ensuring prompt payment down the supply chain, fair contract terms, and not the unfair transfer of risk that we've seen in the past. Secondly, our role is to support the industry to realise that vision. I mean, we all know this is a highly competitive industry, margins are low. One bad job can wipe out all the profits that you've generated through delivering 10 projects successfully. And as a result, the sector has historically underinvested in things like skills and innovation, which are the longer term drivers of productivity. And it's productivity improvements that will ultimately make this a more sustainable industry. And I think it is therefore one of the biggest contributions that the government can make. And this is something that we've been trying to do for the last 2 years through the Transforming Construction Challenge, is actually work with the industry to develop and then facilitate the adoption of a whole range of new technologies. And this isn't just sort of digital in the sense of BIM or a shift to off-site manufacturing, which I think is happening anyway. Yes, we can push that on to the next level, but I think that the basic trend is there, and the basic trend is driven by demographics and client demand. But it's actually pushing the envelope in other areas. For example, it's looking at the application of artificial intelligence to enable better planning and scheduling of construction jobs. It's looking at distributed ledger technology to manage payments and quality control within construction supply chains, which hopefully will negate the need for some of the contractual and payment practices that we've seen in the past. And it's also looking at the development of things like new materials and construction techniques, so we can build better performing and safer buildings and help the industry to deliver what we need in the longer term around a shift to net zero carbon, more sustainable building materials, and facilitate the development of a circular economy within the construction industry. So I think there's a very important role that government can play, but equally I think that there's an important role that industry and the private sector can play, which is working with us on all of these things, and actually to get the industry to generate its own ideas, its own projects, and to try and push these things forwards, and to, if you like, present some solutions to us in terms of new technologies and working practices and other things, and to push us to be receptive as clients and be the first client that's wanting to use some of those new technologies and new techniques.
Great, thanks, Fergus. Well, I think that's a really good summary there. Infrastructure is already very prominent in the news. I think your point, Anne, around data centres, and I suppose working in those sectors which are naturally experiencing some positivity is really, really important. But I think, kind of, Andy, building on from what you said in the first section, I think one of the things which we're not talking about much is how we're all still having to deal with people, and behaviours are going to influence a lot of whether it's a collaborative recovery or one where it's kind of trying to make the best of what's available. So in the interest of that, I'll just move on, or building on from that, sorry, I'll just move on to learning from past recessions. And before the global pandemic started, I think there was definitely a shift towards value based procurement, and companies were able to be more selective than they were years ago. And I know this is a topic kind of very near and dear to your heart. So I suppose my question is, how do you think we do learn from the sort of suicide bidding we've seen in years gone by and win the argument of cost versus value?
How is a very short word and a very long question.
Yeah.
So I think that there are a number of things in place or being put in place that will certainly help. I mean, the first part is really to make sure that clients, and whether these are public sector or private sector, whether they're, you know, one-off clients or building huge programs of work, have a really, really clear idea of their ultimate objective. I think that one of the things that happens with construction is that the construction activity itself is seen as the product, when actually it's not really. It's the enabler. It's the actual use of the asset that is the ultimate product. So, you know, if you're building a school, then it's the education of children. If you're building a house, it should be you know, a pleasant place to live that satisfies your family's demands, sort of thing. And if we reduce everything down to square meterage and cost per square meterage, then what we do is we completely forget about that end product. So the work that we're currently doing, again, this is work that's sponsored by government, it's being done as part of the Transforming Construction Challenge, is saying, well, can we come up with a sort of a universally acceptable definition of value, so that when clients are beginning to consider the building process, they're not just talking about cost, they're actually talking about the very thing that they're trying to achieve. And certainly our definition of value includes social value, it includes environmental impact, it includes the quality of the final product, it includes the impact that it has on the end users, etc. So it's a very wide definition. But we accept, I think everybody accepts, that all clients have many demands on resources, and actually cost is probably the easiest one to measure. And so it's not just coming up with a definition of value, it's also coming up with, if you like, a hierarchy of value. What we find particularly in the public sector, but private sector clients have this as well, is that everything, we have lots and lots of demands, but they're all in silos. So, you know, you need to be environmentally sustainable, you need to create social value, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas it's this holistic, how do all these things work together? And when we actually understand what this hierarchy of value is, then how can we actually build the thing that's going to be most effective in delivering that? Now, that's not disregarding cost, because if you only have a set budget, you only have a set budget. But it's saying, how can you get the best absolute performance value out of the budget that you can afford to spend? So it really is about, one, changing outlook to be much more long-term, but two, providing the tools and actually the data and the maths to enable people to make rational decisions rather than to sort of make almost knee-jerk decisions that always come back to lowest price.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I think certainly the definition of value is something which probably is starting to be talked about a little bit more. So one of the obvious things here is, like, what do clients really care about? So from your point of view, Matt, what do you think clients see value in right now?
I think clients, the value equation has always been one about, you know, does it solve or meet a fundamental need of mine, and those needs have absolutely changed. So yeah, we have a lot of agenda items that have been on the table and being worked through in terms of improved manufacturing, lower carbon. But you know, Anne made a really good point about, you know, the ultimate use of the building. I think clients increasingly are looking for solutions to provide them with the space that they need to be as productive as they can be within the current environment. I'd actually love to see us as an industry embrace what other industries have done in terms of things like space as a service, where, you know, people come together and create solutions around which organizations can run their businesses better without necessarily needing to get into the intricacies and complexities of our industry. Because one thing our industry is very good at is talking about itself. So I think clients will see value where you're perhaps bringing more of the value chain to them, with less interfaces, with that or the client needing to have less interfaces with the overall process itself.
And Fergus, from your point of view, kind of how do you see the shift to value-based procurement kind of actually happening?
I actually think it's a very simple answer to that question. It's equipping people with the tools to define what value means in the context of a particular procurement or program, which is something I simply don't think that we've ever had. Because actually, if you look back over the last 20, 25 years within government, the guidance has always been very clear. It said that we should be adopting a value-based approach. The challenge has always been, well, what does that actually mean? To what are we ascribing value in the context of this procurement? And because people haven't had the tools to give themselves answers to that question, they've fallen back on what I'd call the pseudo-certainty of cost, because that appears to be the hard metric within the bids that have come forward in response to a tender that you can assess them against. I mean, the reality is that isn't the case, and it's certainly not the case once you get into the construction phase, but it appears to be a hard metric on which you can take a decision to procure from supplier A as opposed to supplier B and protect yourself from a legal challenge, which is something that's always been a concern for the public sector's construction client, in the way it's been a concern for private sector construction clients. So this is why we attach a lot of importance to the work that Anne's been leading around procuring for value, because we see it's essential to equip people with the tools that enable them to take informed decisions about what they mean by value and what priority they want to ascribe to reducing energy use of sustainable materials, or delivering wider social value through a contract. And actually, once you have that approach, you've got something that you can then build into the tender and procurement process that means it's both intelligible for the industry bidding in, but also enables those people who are ultimately going to be making the decisions to compare bids based on something that they agreed at the outset constituted the definition of value for this particular project.
Andy?
Well, my starting point of this is Anne's definition was actually music to my ears. In very simple terms, nobody ever wants to buy a building site. That's not what they're buying. They're buying the end product, and it's for the use the building's intended for. So, and that's the way that we've positioned ourselves as a company for a long time. It's the end product which is important. If we could deliver a building in no time rather than 2 years, then that's what the customer ultimately want. But I keep coming back, it's probably a bit of a crap record today. I think we've got to come back to where we are as an industry today. Time is of the essence. We do not have time anymore to keep playing around with this. People have got to start to be brave, and that braveness has to come from those who are buying the buildings. It's buyer behaviour which ultimately determines the procurement route, the pricing levels, and we're already seeing some really bad behaviours coming through from, I'm going to say it again, government departments who have stated that they're going to go back to rebid projects that they've already bid because they believe that the industry is now in a time where we can get it cheaper. So they're back to price. And we're seeing that behaviour come through. Now, we'll walk away from those customers clearly as an organisation, but others won't. So it's really important, as I say, that time is of the essence. There's some great stuff going on as well, some really exciting stuff. We are starting to see some, especially in the sort of housing market, where people are looking at the social footprint, they're looking at community value, they're looking at the carbon aspect. Again, we need to balance that with fire strategy, because there's a natural conflict between what materials are sustainable and carbon beneficial with those which burn. So we've got to bring those equations together and actually resolve those situations. You know, one of the participants on this has asked, you know, is this going to be an evolution or a revolution? Well, I think it needs to be a revolution, because I think we've been trying to do an evolution for too long. So, and that revolution needs to start now. And it has to come, as I say, from buying behavior and really nailing down what value is. And that will then drive how we perform.
And I think one of the underlying point from a lot of what we're talking about here is shared risk, particularly, well, I mean, in an extreme context, you know, where we've got, like Andy's mentioning, some companies who are walking away from projects, and then others who will just take on, you know, an amount of risk which is unsustainable. So just wondered what role you think shared risk plays in creating value.
So my take on risk is just one side of a coin, and the other side of the coin has to be reward or incentivization. And you can't have an industry that's just based on pushing risk away unless you also accept that you should be pushing reward away as well, i.e. sharing the reward to other places. And, you know, I spoke to a contractor once who had a very interesting take on risk. He said, well, you know, people, clients will often say, well, I manage my risk really well, but was it just that they were lucky? Because, of course, not all risks happen on all projects. And it's possible that you could have delivered a whole portfolio of projects and none of these risks that you were trying to offset actually occurred. But that doesn't mean that in the wider environment they haven't occurred. It's just that they haven't occurred on your projects. So my take on risk is that it has to be in the very first conversation. In fact, it has to be in a funding conversation. It's not even actually often about the client. It's pre-client, because if the risk profile of the project isn't properly understood, then the incentive profile of the project can never be properly understood either. And what happens is that often desperate companies take risks that they can't sustain and hope that it won't happen. Or possibly worse, in a way, is that companies don't even understand the risk that they're taking on. And, you know, we've seen huge examples of that with the failure of Carillion, in truth, and the supply chain that was feeding Carillion as well. So this, for me, gets right back to these really, really early stages of client conversations. It's not just asking a client, you know, what it is they're trying to achieve ultimately with the asset that they're constructing, but it's also having a really serious conversation about the risk, the funder's risk, their risk, the contractor's risk, everybody else's risk, and the incentivization to perform. And my view is that if those two things are taken in parallel, then that massively increases collaboration, because people can see that their effort will be rewarded. They won't just be beaten around the head. And it also increases innovation, because if people can genuinely get reward for doing something faster, cheaper, better, rather than actually being told, oh no, that doesn't fit into the profile of the project, so we don't want it, then you'll get a better industry. So this is all about really grown-up conversations at the beginning of the building process. And I'm talking about the very beginning, not the bricks on site, if you like.
Great. Well, I think that those early conversations around shared risk, I think, are absolutely correct. And I think one of the things we're always guilty of is kind of starting off a project and assuming and planning for everything to go exactly according to plan, which you know we know doesn't happen. So in terms of how to make change actually happen, I think one of a good place to start here is there's stuff happening now which could probably be mandated and enforced to a better level. Now I might be wrong, but Andy, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on kind of how can we mandate and enforce initiatives which are already existing.
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. I think, you know, many years of running not only construction companies but in other sector companies, my general principle about getting initiatives to stick and to work is you go slightly overkill to start with. So you really have to drive that behavior to embed it. So if we take that as a basic principle of management, then that's what we've got to do. We've got to drive behaviors which will make sure that this becomes a habit and the normal way of doing it. as I say, this sort of gentle evolution is not working quickly enough. So if you take procurement routes, well, then you've got to mandate them. If you take the way that we've seen digital revolution coming into the industry, again, it's been slow, it's been painful, and people, again, have dropped back to looking at things like BIM as a cost, not a benefit. And we ended up making the decision that we would run it on our projects irrespective of whether the client wanted to or not, and whether the client was going to pay for it or not, because we saw the benefit side rather than the cost side. Again, as an organisation, we have our own offsite manufacturing company. We've had it for 12 years. We've been in that market for 12 years. It's been really, really difficult to get people to understand the benefits of it, because they're looking at procurement routes based on cost, not the value side and not the speed side of what that brings to the equation. Now, it's really exciting to see that government are really starting to push modern methods of construction. I think this latest crisis will accelerate that. There are clear departments which are really embracing it. So I'm really pleased about how that's doing. But as Matt will probably support me on, the whole industry in offsite is so small at the moment that we could swan that industry very, very quickly if we're not careful. So, but it is a great time to actually look at how we can embrace those things. So to me, the big things, procurement, digital, and then on to offsite manufacturing are the key things, but mandate them as best we possibly can. And I think if we then package all of that lot together, what we can present is the other part of our equation, which is skills. And we have a very, very appealing industry with such a mixed portfolio of needs that, and what we produce is life-changing products. If there is, I just find it the second most important industry after food. And it's that appealing. If you want to come into this sector, why wouldn't you? It's an unbelievably appealing industry to be associated with. So we can drive all of that lot, but I do believe we need to mandate a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on your point, Andy, I completely agree that behaviours are the place to start. And funnily enough, when we're on this sort of the previous topic about value-based procurement, we need to ensure that these things don't become a process and that they remain a philosophy. And that's where great leadership is going to come from, and that all clients and all of industry and the supply side work to that philosophy. That there is a huge issue with capacity coming in the offsite and modern methods, with all modern methods of construction. And we're also trying to solve problems that, as I said before, no one really has all of the answers to. And my point here would be, I think sometimes some of the industry initiatives start too big. And if you look at the way that some of the big digital innovations have come through in other sectors, it's all about looking at what the fundamental need is, what the fundamental use case is, and starting small, doing very small proof of concepts. But the key point is all parties working together to prove that proof of concept, not bound by traditional procurement methods, genuinely coming together as an ecosystem to try and solve a problem. And for me, that is the philosophy that this industry needs to get into, and that's the leadership that needs to come from all aspects, whether they're government, clients, or industry side.
I think that's a really, really important point, but particularly when you mention around kind of starting small and not sort of telling a client to care about something they fundamentally might not care about. So I suppose from your point of view, Fergus, there's an obvious debate here over what regulation do we need and what level of regulation. So just wanted sort of your thoughts on that.
I think well, let me ask you 3 questions, and then I'll come to the theme of regulation as part of the response to question 3. I mean, in terms of the role of the private sector in this, I think it's change of culture, change of behaviours would be the thing that would have the biggest impact. And this is something that can be done now. It doesn't need to wait for technology solutions to arrive. It's prompt payment, fair contractual terms, better collaboration and greater information sharing, and better organisation of the supply chain. All of these things are required. All of these things would have positive benefits for the industry. All of these things would improve the image of the industry immeasurably, and all of these things would lay the groundwork for the kind of transformational change that's going to happen over the next 10 years. On the second question about what if the client doesn't see value, well, I think you're going to have to accept that there may well be some clients who will forevermore always focus on the bottom line and the lowest cost. Hopefully that will change over time, and as people are equipped with tools and knowledge and the regulatory, social, economic environment changes, people will start to focus much more on value because they recognise that they need to build buildings that are safer or more energy efficient or whatever. But at this point in time, I think the most important thing we can do is try and educate people and make people aware of what opportunities exist to do things better. And then finally, in relation to support from contractors and from government, I think the industry does need a fair, transparent and clear regulatory framework. We do need to clear up some areas which have been problematic in the past. Building safety would be the one that I would highlight as an area in need of significant reform, which will happen in the next couple of years. Looking to the future, what we need to do is put in a clear regulatory framework that pushes people to build more sustainable and energy efficient buildings. The construction industry is different from almost every other sector in the economy, in that in this country you can start from the fundamental assumption that what you build now will probably be there in 2050, and therefore at the point at which the UK needs to be net zero carbon, that built asset needs to be making a contribution to achieving that objective. So government needs to put in place a regulatory framework that sets out a pathway and a framework within which people can work to deliver that, and also pushes the industry to design and deliver better buildings, or buildings which can be improved over the course of their life, as opposed to focusing on creating buildings of once and for all project. The other area, I think other areas where government can help, I think it's the ones that have been previously mentioned. The industry is notorious for having a boom bust cycle. This drives all sorts of bad behaviours, and it drives an unsustainable business model. Probably the single biggest thing that government could do is adopt a counter-cyclical policy approach towards the construction industry, where whenever there is a downturn or a dearth of demand, we are willing to step in, and then actually, in the classically Keynesian way, where there's a great deal of private sector investment or consumer-led investment coming in, we perhaps step back to avoid pushing the industry too hard and overinflating the construction or property bubble as a result of doing that. And then finally, I think it is this point about government behaving consistently as a client in terms of the way in which it engages with the industry, but also in terms of what it demands of the industry by way of use of digital technologies and off-site manufacturing to deliver programs, and working with the industry to identify what the pathway is to getting to a point where the vast majority of new buildings that we are procuring and are being used to meet housing need, educational need, new hospitals, prisons, whatever they are actually being built using these technologies, so there is that sustainable pipeline of demand, which is absolutely essential to making a manufacturing business model work.
I mean, one of the, I suppose, kind of thinking just about a couple of your answers, Fergus. A lot of what you're saying is really based around kind of simplifying change, really. And I mean, in your opinion, as an industry, do we overcomplicate change?
No, I think this is a more complicated industry than many people perceive it to be. I mean, you could argue about whether it's got the right kind of complexity, because I think a lot of problems are caused by the nature of the supply chain and the nature of the business model and the fragmentation of the industry. But I actually think the industry has got a very high level of capability. You face an information and a coordination challenge to bringing people together and making best use of that capability to deliver the sort of transformational change that's required. But okay, that is a big challenge because of the sheer number of organisations that need to be involved. But equally, it's not an insoluble problem, and there are plenty of processes, technologies, and approaches to doing this that have been developed in other industries. I mean, I'm thinking of things like the aerospace and the automotive sector that can be translated to construction, and that's what we're actively trying to do through things like the Transforming Construction Programme. So yes, I mean, the industry is playing catch up. It's got a lot of ground to cover in a fairly short space of time, and its current structure doesn't help it do that. But equally, it doesn't need to solve every problem itself. It needs to work out how to adopt solutions that other people have been developed. The thing it really needs to focus on is now becoming this information coordination challenge.
I think that leads on really nicely to our final question, which is around transforming productivity. Andy, you mentioned at the start of the webinar the fact that we've got pre-agreed projects and they're running at a lower level of productivity. So I think from your point of view, where do you see the biggest productivity drains actually affecting projects today?
Yeah, I mean, if I start with how I describe a classic UK construction project. So the way I always imagine you're going to build a car, but you're building a car in the middle of a green field with no roof over it, and you're going to a whole series of separate suppliers, all bringing their individual components together, and we're bolting this product together. And as we go through it, we design bits of the car as we're progressing the construction of the car. And towards the end, we try to get this thing to work, and we end up with a few type of what we call snags, and it doesn't fully work. And in the automobile industry, we call that a prototype. So that's what we're producing. We're producing prototype after prototype. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. So productivity to me starts with design. If we haven't got a fully robust design at the point that we start construction, then we're always struggling with the productivity. And that's where contractual issues become into play, because we're waiting on design. Whose responsibility is it for design? Where the interface of the design, specialist designers are meeting with engineers and architects and still trying to get this thing to work on the hoof on site. So to me, a greater degree of standardization is needed across the industry. We can still make amazingly looking buildings, but we can actually build them with a whole series of standard products rather than having to bespoke everything as we go along. So that's where it all comes back to. And then it comes back to the information hub, as we call it, the data, creating the virtual building digitally, all of those things which will allow us to assess value, allow us to assess how the building's going to perform, get the data on how the building's performing so that we can build it into future cost models and future design models. So it's thinking a lot more about how data will play its part and how that design works. But to me, the essential part of the whole thing comes back to the design. Okay. And then we can think about how we build it and how we can build it efficiently and effectively. And that comes through collaboration. And the industry is very fragmented, as we know, but we have a series of very good specialists, and they're key to be engaged with the design process as early as possible so that we know how to build it. And that's the meeting of minds. You've got the design experts, but you've got the people who know how to build it. And it's putting those two aspects together, which creates these amazing products that we end up with. And we have got some amazing buildings across the country. It's not only buildings, but it's infrastructure. It's the same principle across the piece. And this has all been, this should all be accelerated by what the latest crisis has brought to us, because it should make us start to think about how we can be more efficient. And there are times, and we have heard it, where certain trains are being more effective on site now. across the piece it's not, but there are some trades which are big because it's forced people to think about how they're going to work on site and to rethink. So I think we got the foundations to do it. I think should have the desire to do it, and the industry needs to do it. So, as Fergus says, that's only going to happen with a more collaborative approach about the whole contract.
I think so. Kind of what you're saying is the design information flow, by it being representing a drain and obstacle at the moment, is probably the place to start in terms of looking to streamline and standardise something. Matt, from I suppose on this topic generally, as a director of a software company, I'm fairly biased and would encourage everyone to invest as much as they possibly can in technology. But I think, it's about more than that. So from your point of view, Matt, where do you see the opportunities to meaningfully innovate?
I think that point about too much of our industry being build and design is absolutely well made by Andy. I think one of the big opportunities to innovate is once we are clear on the design, actually to work out how the thing is going to be built, and that drives a completely different thought process. So the way we look at projects, when we look at them, almost the first thing we do is say, well, how are we going to put that together? We use that to drive back into the design process, and that's where we find a lot of waste. And it's also where you find, everybody talking the story of, well, yeah, we're using BIM, but actually, are people truly working on federated models? And that step alone could drive a whole load of waste out of the process. But tying a few of the earlier points together, I think the biggest innovations are really understanding how buildings are being used and how they are performing in use. And collecting the data in there. So we've now invested in making sure that all of our buildings are smart buildings, and as we work on programs like we do with people like the Ministry of Defence, project to project, we're able to collect the data on how those buildings are being used, which bits of kit are being underused, which bits are being overused, and it's really only then that you can truly get into the real innovations that will drive us towards lower carbon, zero carbon buildings, and buildings that perform in the way that they were intended to be used. And if they're not, buildings that can be told to perform in a different way so that they do work in the way that they're intended to use. And I think, going back to the car analogy, we have to get to the situation where we're thinking about a customer experience. We're not just thinking about getting a physical product up, brushing our hands in that muddy green field that Andy was talking about, and walking away at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think obviously, I think the point you mentioned around standardizing what can be standardized and not everything kind of has to be completely bespoke is really, really valid, and obviously does hopefully represent kind of Modular's big chance, really. In a broader sense, Fergus, from your point of view, are there one or two positive examples of improving productivity on site which you've seen, which you think are worth sharing? Fergus, you might be on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay. No worries. So, go on.
I think we've seen some fantastic innovations over the last 2 or 3 years that genuinely could transform productivity. The one that I would point to that we've been working on with a number of organisations in the public and private sector is an approach which is derived from what's been done in the automotive and aerospace sectors now for 25 or 30 years, of producing buildings based on product platforms. There have been 2 or 3 projects that we've supported through the Transforming Construction programme that aim to do exactly that. And I think that is one of the innovations that could have the most transformative impact, because it would completely change the way in which we conceive of built assets, design them, and then actually go about really assembling them on site And it opens up a lot of opportunities to make the supply chain a lot more efficient and bring more firms into it to perform various different roles, and to make it a more open, democratic and collaborative supply chain for the delivery of even very large projects. We're also looking at a number of digital technologies. I mean, I think the potential for artificial intelligence is absolutely tremendous in terms of being able to make sense of all sorts of data about construction projects that's gathered from all sorts of examples, identify comparable construction projects, and help to better plan and monitor the implementation of these. BIM, yes, huge potential, but I think we know that doesn't need to be talked about. But one of the other areas that we've been looking at, and this builds on some work done by the National Infrastructure Commission in the Data for Public Good report, is the creation of a national digital twin. So rather in the way that Formula One teams have digital twins of Formula One cars when they're racing, which feed real-time information about the performance of the car and the various components of the control room, it's perfectly possible to envisage a world where built assets are managed in the same way, but you also have the ability to exchange data between those built assets, and for those built assets to compare information about performance, for example. And this is something that could be genuinely transformational in terms of our ability to manage the built environment more effectively and to deliver much better public services, and also enable the private sector to provide various services more efficiently to people too. So yes, I mean, there's an enormous amount of innovation that is currently underway within the industry. And I would honestly say, I think in 10 years' time, the industry will look completely different and operate in a completely different way. Certainly if you're looking at large-scale construction, infrastructure, buildings, delivery of buildings in the public sector, probably new houses as well. I think there'll still be a fair number of people doing similar things in the domestic RMI sector, in the same way that we still have the old thatched roofer doing business in the UK now. But from the perspective of the biggest, most high-profile infrastructure and construction projects, I think in 10 years' time, people will look back and say, wow, the industry probably moved further forward in a decade than it did in the previous 100 years.
Okay, great. I'm mindful of everyone's time, so we're going to move straight on to Q&A. We're going to start taking some questions. Just going to work through some of those which have come in already. Panelists, first come, first serve in terms of who wants to volunteer to answer these, because the vast majority of them certainly won't be me. In terms of this first question in from Simon Tolson, given competition is global, how is a race to the bottom going to be avoided by UK initiatives?
I'll start with that. I think fundamentally, it does come back, as I say, to procurement, and we've got to look at how people who are procuring buildings are assessing that value equation. And there are all the initiatives that we've talked about. There's modern methods of construction, there's the social agenda, there's the local pound, there's the carbon position, there's the data on how the building is going to be used. All of those things need to be pulled together now into making us a sort of, the leading player in the construction sector across the world, and leading the way. But to me, that starts with procurement. And if the more of that's mandated, the better. Okay, great. Another question in from Fred Mills. Hi, Fred. Hope to chat to you soon. The industry has long struggled to adopt new forms of contract, embrace digital technologies, address race and gender inequality, and attract new talent. Despite the hardship that so many are facing, is the pandemic not an opportunity to hit the reset button and address some of these issues in our race to get back to normal? Are we potentially wasting a good crisis?
Well, maybe if I pick up on that one, it was the example I was trying to give earlier, really. If you just take the real life example of a success actually coming out of the crisis of being able to temporarily house homeless people, and the agenda that's now being driven to permanently house those people. I think, you know, we have to see this as a bigger opportunity to press reset and think about, as I said before, not just providing shelter, but providing training, providing perhaps a managed service, and even mental health therapies as part of an integrated approach towards building new skills, putting people back to work, and enabling them to stand on their own 2 feet, and provide or live in permanent accommodation. Now, that comes back to Andy's point, is I think there are 2 things that need to happen for that. The supply side needs to come together and actually start looking at full end-to-end solutions and bringing those to clients, and then we need to make sure that clients and government are not shooting that down in procurement process, which precludes that level of innovation. And if I have a concern, the concern would be that too often clients come with an innovation agenda, but they already come with we've decided what the solution is and we just want your ideas on innovation to tick the process box. And that's not how it needs to work for me. So I think we need a fundamental shift in that collaboration right at the front end. And I completely agree that needs to be a reset rather than a bit of tweaking around the edges.
Great, thanks,
Can
Matt.
I just follow
Yeah,
on
sure.
that?
Yeah, of course.
Fred, what I think we need is like an amazing YouTube channel that actually pulls together all these fantastic initiatives that our industry does, really projects what a fantastic sector we're in. And if you could sort something like that out, something called B1M or something similar to that, it would be fantastic.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, question for you, Anne. Thanks, Paul. The question is, Anne spoke about risk and reward. Some clients have suggested they would like their consultants to have skin in the game. For those consultants fortunate enough to be able to considering shared risk and reward, do the panel think that this would improve collaboration?
Yes.
Good stuff.
Simply. So I have never really understood. So I started my career client side, if you like, and as I've been on the consultancy side for a long time now, I've never really understood why the consultant team can simply walk away from the project at the point that the design is handed over, or certainly at the point that the building is finished. So, you know, the contractor still has long-term liabilities for the building, but the consultants really only have long-term liabilities if they were actually negligent. And it just strikes me as a bizarre state of affairs that you can say, you know, the building will perform at this level, the building will deliver you these outcomes, the building will do all these things in your marketing material. But actually, if it doesn't do any of them, so long as you've not been negligent, then you just sort of move on to live the next day, if you like. So I think that collaboration comes with responsibility. Collaboration isn't just everyone being nice to each other. Collaboration is understanding what your roles and responsibilities are and fulfilling those roles and responsibilities. So I think that part of collaboration has to be that not just the consultants, but the entire team from, again, funder through to maintainer has to be part of the process, has to have the rewards that come from that, but also has to have the responsibilities too. So absolutely couldn't agree more.
Great. And then last question, one for you, Fergus. So the question here is from Gemma. So thanks very, very much for the question, Gemma. We've got, there does seem to be a shift, although still happening, from suicide bidding to putting more risk pressure on contractors, which may be sustainable to a major contractor, but more damaging to an SME contractor. I wonder if the client may need more pressure on them for the use of ethical partnerships across the supply chain. Fergus?
Yes, I mean, I think there does need to be a rebalancing of the approach that's taken when it comes to the negotiation of construction sector contracts. I actually think there isn't necessarily a bad suite of documentation that exists out there in the NEC and JCT suites of contractual documentation. There's a lot of good material in there. They've adapted the contracts to take account of a number of different circumstances, and they're available for use. The problem is that people then try and amend these contracts to their own advantage. And in an ideal world, this is something that you would weed out. I mean, it's something that we have tried to do in government. I wouldn't say we've been entirely successful across every single organisation, but we have actively tried to standardise the clauses and the terms and conditions that we include in our own contracts, and to try and push these down the supply chain. And ensure there is replication of contract terms. So yes, I think there's a very strong case for doing this, but it does come back to this point about clients being engaged, particularly public sector clients, trying to drive this, but also changing the culture and the behaviour within the industry and its legal advisors, and actually getting people to question whether what they are doing, regardless of whether or not they perceive it to be in the narrow interest of the organisation for which they work for, is actually in the overall interest of the supply chain that's delivering the project and the overall interest of the industry going forward.
Great. Well, we'll move on. We'll move on really just to summarise by thanking everyone. It's great to see such a kind of highly engaged webinar. Really, thank you very much to our speakers. We're really fortunate. I think everyone's been really fortunate to hear from a good spectrum from a a consultancy point of view, modular as well as a main contractor, and obviously the government. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much to our speakers. In terms of if you'd like to learn more about these topics, as I mentioned at the start, there'll be a 15-page leadership playbook which will be full of action advice on the different areas we've discussed, such as growing pipeline, things you can do on site to improve productivity. If you'd like to know a bit more detail about those areas, then speakers such as Anne is featured on the Changing Construction podcast, which is running a Road to Recovery series. We've also just done an episode with Casey Rutland, which talks through from a digital point of view things which you can do to improve productivity and the role it plays and the role your digital strategy plays when it comes to winning work, which leads on to an event which we've got coming up on the 9th of July, which is really around what can you do in your environment to improve how you're using technology internally, but importantly, the role that plays when you're bidding for work, when you're delivering work, and then when you're trying to reduce risk moving forwards. And that will go into the leadership playbook moving forward. So we'd like this effectively to be a 20 to 25-page document which outlines the key strategies businesses are using at the moment to succeed. So I haven't really got anything else to add other than just thank you very much, Fergus and Matt, Andy. Just genuinely brilliant to have you on. So thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, Fergus. Thanks a lot.